All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Denise Tokunaga. I am a board member for Seattle City Club, and I'm excited to welcome you to our first event this year, the 2025 Legislative Preview. So thank you for coming, and I want to extend a special thanks to our legislators. I know that you are extremely busy right now as you get ready for sessions, so thank you for taking the time, and thank you all for coming today for what I'm sure will be a very robust conversation. I also want to express thanks to the staff here at the Collective, Bermudez Media, and our sponsors for today's event, Puget Sound Energy and Comcast. And finally, please help me welcome our two moderators for today. I'm very excited to introduce Angela King, journalist and news host for KUOW, and Drew Mikkelsen, the South Bureau Chief for King 5. So I will turn it over to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, everyone, for showing up today. Like Denise said, we're looking forward to a very robust conversation, and I do say conversation. We want to hear from everyone in the room, as well as our lawmakers here who were, again, generous enough with their time to join us today. So basically, the format we're going to follow is we're going to ask the legislators about their key priorities for the upcoming legislative session that begins Monday, and it will be a mix of long-form questions, some lightning round questions. We're also going to be fielding questions from all of you here in the room, those who'd like to ask questions. And for those in the online audience, you can go ahead and submit your questions in the chat box. And right now, I'm going to let Drew go ahead and introduce our panel.
Very good. Thank you very much for coming here, and thank you to the Collective. It's a beautiful spot. Last year, we had a kind of heated discussion. If things do get heated, we have a climbing wall for you guys to work out your aggressions on if needed. These are not only legislators, these are some of the big movers and shakers down in Olympia. They are members of the leadership, and I want to introduce, starting here on the left, we have Senator Manka Dhingra. She is a Democrat from Redmond. She is the Senate Deputy Majority Leader. To her left is Senator John Braun. He is a Republican from Lewis County, Senate Minority Leader. Beside him is Republican Representative Drew Stokesbary from Auburn, also Notre Dame, so congratulations to your team last night. He is the House Republican Leader. It was a close one, right? The House Republican Leader. And last but not least, Representative Joe Fitzgibbon. He is from West Seattle, the Democratic House Majority Leader. So thank you all for making time for us. I know you're busy. Some of you came up from the south, some of you came from the east side. So we appreciate you all getting here, and we'll get right to it with a question from Angela.
Yes, and we're just going to go straight across left to right. And first question is, what are two bills that you hope to see passed during this legislative session, and what is the one that you think should not see the light of day?
You know, I can be glib and say our budget, the operating budget and our transportation budget. And that is something that we are going to pass. I am going to pick a couple of policy bills, and I will pick one because I love highlighting the work the youth in my district do. And one of the bills that they brought to me this session is to actually ask or mandate that our bars and clubs provide drug testing strips for sale, because the rate of drug-facilitated sexual assaults in our state is rising. And I just always love to highlight our youth and their engagement in our process, and so I definitely want to highlight that. But we do have to make sure we're passing our operating budget and the transportation budget. And unfortunately, we do have bills that try to restrict a woman's right to an abortion, and those will definitely not be getting a hearing in my Committee on Law and Justice.
Senator Braun.
All right, well, that's a good question. I'm going to copy, actually, budget, but I'm going to add some caveats. Operating budget obviously has to pass. I hope it passes on time in 105 days. And I hope it passes, and it's got to be balanced constitutionally, and I hope it passes without new revenue. Because I think we can do the right thing for the people of the state without adding additional revenue and putting more burden on taxpayers. The other one I hope passed, and I think has a pretty good chance because I think we have bipartisan support, is a bill that Senator Holy has run for several years and Governor-elect Ferguson has supported, which puts some additional funding into hiring and retaining law enforcement officers around our state. And my hope is not only that the bill passes, that includes the additional funding, but it also addresses some of the other issues we have in recruiting and retaining the best and brightest into law enforcement in our state. We have the lowest number of law enforcement per capita in the country. We don't need to be at the top, but we ought to shoot to be in the middle, and this would be an important step forward. This is something we're seeing more and more bipartisan support of. In terms of bills, I hope don't pass. I think the one that I am opposed to that's getting the most attention right now is the rent control, rent stabilization bill. And I absolutely understand the desire for that. You know, rent increases have been too high, and too hard for people to deal with in our state. We have a real issue there. I have just deep concerns based on a lot of data, a lot of economics that say this may or may not help in the short term, but will almost certainly hurt in the long term as we try to recruit more capital into our state. Because the real problem isn't, the reason those rents go up is because of the scarcity of housing. We have a housing crisis in our state. Discouraging capital from entering and spending and being invested in Washington will not solve the problem. It may feel good in the near term, but it will do more damage than good. And I hope we find a better solution.
Okay. Representative Stokesbary.
Yeah, well, in my mind, the two biggest issues facing Washington are public safety and affordability. We have crises with respect to both. You pick virtually any statistic you want, and Washington is one of the worst performing states when it comes to both public safety. We got the fewest police officers of any state in the country per capita. We have among the highest crime rates in all kinds of categories. We have the top 5 for most expensive housing, gas, groceries. Voters tell us that those are the two things that they're concerned the most about is public safety and affordability. So in terms of two bills I want passed, something that deals with each of those. John mentioned one public safety bill. I had a version similar to that would give a grant program of $100 million to cities and counties to hire more police officers. The governor-elect has actually supported that. He ran on that idea. So hopefully there can be some bipartisan consensus on something, whether that's hiring more police officers, making concealment or organized retail theft a crime, something to show the people of Washington that we're taking their concerns seriously and want to make Washington a safer place to live. With affordability, again, whether we're talking about eliminating the tax on diapers or other essentials for new moms, prepared food, which is something that's currently taxed, even though groceries are not, is something that working families really need. Whether we're going to figure out a way to offset the high cost of gas driven by the Climate Commitment Act, something to show Washingtonians that we understand the struggles they've been going through, and we want to help them make living their daily lives a little easier. In terms of things I don't want to see pass, I don't think we should pass any tax bills. Washington has among the highest taxes in the nation. There was just a cross-cut Elway poll that came out yesterday that showed 65% of Washingtonians would rather have the state legislature find ways to reduce spending by reducing or delaying state programs rather than raise state taxes. Only 20% of Washingtonians think we should raise taxes. The state budget has more than doubled in my 10 years in the legislature. We need to figure out how to live within our means and spend smartly and wisely, and not just continually ask the people of Washington for more money, especially now that the only things left to tax are things that would be very detrimental to our economy, like jobs themselves, innovation itself, or housing. We can't make housing more affordable if we're making it more expensive. So we shouldn't put taxes on the table. We should solve the problem we have without new taxes.
All right, thank you. And Representative Fitzgibbon.
Well, I'll choose a bipartisan kumbaya answer to this and echo my friend Drew in picking a public safety priority and an affordability priority. Senator Lovick's bill to lower the legal driving limit for blood alcohol content from 0.08 to 0.05, we know would save lives. We know from evidence in other countries, other jurisdictions, that a lower legal driving, that driving at 0.08 is impaired and does cause a greater risk of injury or death on the roadways. So that bill has made it out of the Senate, I believe, with bipartisan support. Don't quote me on that. In the past, and we haven't gotten it out of the House yet. I hope that this year we were able to finish the job with the BAC bill. And then on affordability, I'm excited about, I'm a new father this year as of June 9th. And so now experiencing the stage of parenthood where you look for childcare, and we know how unaffordable and unavailable. There's just not enough childcare slots, and the ones that are available are very expensive. And so I'm excited about soon-to-be former Representative Sen has introduced a bill to create additional pathways for childcare providers to get certified. Tana has been selected by Governor-elect Ferguson to run the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, so we will miss her, but before she's gone, she's introduced a bill that will hopefully help us alleviate our childcare provider shortage. Oh, and then what I hope doesn't pass. There's bills introduced in both the House and the Senate that would rescind our vehicle emission standards and allow vehicles to pollute more in Washington State. You know, we just saw 62% of the voters reject an attempt to repeal the Climate Commitment Act. Washingtonians have shown they care about clean air, they care about progress in the fight against climate change, and I don't foresee bills to rescind our vehicle emission standards and leaving us at the mercy of the Trump EPA, likely to move forward.
All right, thank you very much. You each dipped your toe into a couple of hot topics that we will have a little more time to talk about in a little bit, so that'll give you all a chance to be heard on those issues. But we can't ignore the budget. That is the one legal obligation that you have during this 105-day session, which starts on Monday. Depending who you ask, but let's talk about the budget forecasters. They say you're going to have about a $12 billion deficit over the next 4 years. I know that number has been debated, but the number is what it is at this point. We're going to talk about what Bob Ferguson brought up yesterday in a moment. But first, I want to talk to each of you. This time we'll start with you, Senator Braun, so we'll make it even and go down one at a time. Can this budget be balanced without raising news taxes and just relying on cuts? Does it have to be a little bit of both? I think I know where you stand on that, but that's a big number.
Yeah, and there's a lot to talk about here. I think first you got to recognize, at least at the high level, how we got here. And in the current biennium, our budget's $72 billion. Our revenue is $67 billion. So in the current biennium, we're going to spend $5 billion more than we take in, and that's what's and it's based on some one-time money from the stimulus package, some reserves from the state, but it was clearly unsustainable in the future. And then so. Going into the next biennium, and they talk about the 4-year balance, they say, and there's various numbers out there, anywhere from, I think actually Ways and Means nonpartisan staff has the maintenance level deficit about $6.7 billion. People will say 10 billion. I've heard 12. I've heard 18. Depends. And when it grows from that, it's because they're adding new policy changes and calling that part of the deficit. So just use I think the most common is the 12 you mentioned. Just about half of that, $5 million is new policy, and $5 billion is new policy. Four of those $1 billion is the new collective bargaining agreements for state employees. Now, we should and do pay our state employees well, but when you're faced with a $12 billion deficit, this is not the time to enact a record-setting new collective bargaining agreement, and that is something the law allows the governor or the governor-elect, once he takes office, to say, these are financially infeasible, which means you can go back and negotiate and say, hey, we may want to do this, we just may need to stretch it out over a period of time, but find a way that's more affordable than $4 billion in new spending to deliver no more services. Another $1 billion is some policies that we've all voted, in many cases bipartisan basis, voted on, and good ideas, some child care stuff, which is good, early education, which is good, but it's not something we're delivering today. And when you're faced with a deficit, just like at home, you say, that's not something I can afford today. Maybe we can scale it at a different time frame, but we can get back to that. We're not taking anything away. So nearly half of that you can address by not doing new stuff. The rest of the stuff, and I think you want to have other people talk, so I won't talk too much longer, is really about growth. The growth for revenue in our state is well below where it has been historically. Historically, it's 4.5% per year, 9% for biennium, or 2.6% for this biennium. We have done things, regulatory actions that have stifled growth in our state. We're not in a recession, but we're pretty stagnant. We can do things to address that, and I think that will help us balance the budget over the long term, over the 4-year.
Thank you. Representative Stokesbary.
Yeah, I agree with what Senator Braun said. I mean, I'll build on a couple things he pointed out. He said right at the end, we're not in a recession. I think that's important to understand. If we were in a recession and Republicans were in the minority, it'd be really easy for us to say, oh, look at those Democrats in the majority that passed a budget, and now there's a big deficit. Well, Candidly, if Republicans were in the majority and then we hit a recession, our budget would probably be in the negative too. But that's not the situation we're in. No serious economist thinks we're in a recession. The debate is whether the economy is doing good or great. And we're still in this enormous hole, by far the biggest shortfall we've had going into session since the Great Recession. By definition, I mean, it's a tautology. You cannot get into that big of a hole when revenue is growing unless you have misspent while the revenue is going up. And so to answer your question, Drew, yes, I do think we can balance the budget without new taxes because revenue is continuing to go up. If revenue were going down, then you would have to cut things, and then you would have some serious considerations of, is this cut to balance the budget without taxes going to hurt people? But by definition, because revenue keeps going up, we don't have to cut on a gross level. We just have to cut some of the increases. It's like if I remember the Christmas Vacation movie with Chevy Chase, right? I mean, he thought he was going to get a raise at work, and so he started to build this giant pool. If he had just realized when he knew he wasn't going to get the raise, hey, I should stop building the pool, things would have gone a lot more smoothly. If you think you're going to work and get a bonus, and you're planning to go out to the Met for dinner that night, and then you don't get the bonus, and you decide to go have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich at home rather than going to the Met to celebrate, you're not cutting the dinner. You're just realizing that the money isn't there to afford the Met that night, and you got to have a sandwich at home instead. That's the situation we're in. We will have more tax revenue this next year than the last year, and more revenue the year after that than next year, and so on. We just need to figure out how to live within our means, and I think we can do that without raising taxes and without cutting services that people depend on, which Republicans don't want to harm vulnerable people either, despite what you might have heard on TV.
So Jelly of the Month Club subscriptions are going to all of your constituents, just like in Christmas Vacation. Representative Fitzgibbon.
Sure. Well, I don't think there's a question of, well, can we balance the budget with cuts alone? We can. The question is, should we? And the question is, where would those cuts come from, and what would they mean for people in our state? What would they mean for kids in the public school system? What would they mean for students in our 2-year and 4-year colleges? What would it mean for people experiencing behavioral health crisis, people at Western State Hospital, people with developmental disabilities, people in the prison system, victims of people in the prison system? Of the $12 billion over 4 years, which I think is important to clarify that that's a 4-year number. We're the only state in the country that requires a budget be balanced 4 years into the future. You can debate whether or not that's a good idea, but just to be clear, that's the window of time we're talking about. $4 billion of that $12 billion is increase in the caseload. That's current law caseload in our K-12 school system. Increased enrollment, and of the students who are increased in the increased enrollment in those schools, disproportionate number of those kids are English language learners and need special education. $4 billion of the $12 billion comes from current law obligations to students in our public school system. So you could say, okay, well, we're not going to cut K-12 at all. Well, K-12 is like nearly half the budget. So if you take K-12 off the table, then we're talking about twice as big of cuts to the behavioral health system, to the prison system, to the community college system, to the 4-year institutions, to childcare and early learning. I don't think that the people in our state want to see that. I think that Washingtonians showed us in the November election when they increased the Democratic majorities in each chamber and they rejected 3 Republican initiatives to cut programs that the legislature had prioritized in recent years, that cuts that harm the most vulnerable people in our society, or people that rely on state services like kids in our public school system, or like people in need of long-term care, is just not what the majority of Washingtonians want to see us do, and that Washingtonians would probably rather see us, I think as evidenced by the 65% of voters who rejected a repeal of the capital gains tax, to ask the wealthiest people in our state who pay very little in taxes to pay a little bit more, so that we can take care of kids in the public school system, particularly those who need special education or developmentally disabled folks, people who need long-term care, so forth. So it's not a question of can we, it's a question of should we. It's a question of what is the kind of state that we want to live in, and that, I think, is the fundamental question around what kind of budget we pass this year.
Thank you. Senator Dhingra.
So I'll just start off by saying, any idea what eggs are costing these days? Just how it is getting affordability is an issue for our personal lives. It's same things apply for the state. it is more expensive to take care of the people in our state because inflation is a real thing. And so I think you have to be very thoughtful about the budget. You know, what is it that we are going to do? Who are we going to help? And how are we going to get there? So absolutely, take a really good look at the budget. Use a surgical tool, not a broad-based tool that just got 6% here and 4% there, but let's be surgical about taking a look at where we can save money, but really have that conversation on if we do not raise revenue, who are we hurting? And I can tell you, I'm sure many of you in this room, maybe some, remember what happened during the recession. Those cuts were made at the backs of the most vulnerable among us. We paid for a decade or more of issues around access to mental health care, taking a look at homelessness, taking a look at substance use disorder. And I can tell you today, parents will tell you they do not have a place to send their kid for inpatient substance use disorder treatment. Do we need that in the state? Yes. When you ask people specifically, do you want the state to invest in more inpatient substance use disorder treatment? People will say yes. When you ask people, do you want us to invest in helping special needs students in our schools? The answer is yes. When you ask people, do you want us to continue to work on homelessness? The answer is yes. These are all the issues that we will be grappling with, and these are all the issues we'll be trying to take a look at. But you have to take a look at, when you balance a budget without new revenue, who is going to get harmed by that? And I, for one, am not going to agree to balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable in the state of Washington.
All right, well, Senator, you talk about funding, and the current governor, Jay Inslee, has proposed a wealth tax, whereas the governor-elect, Bob Ferguson, says not with that, looking for 6% across the board cuts outside of public safety and public education. So do you agree with Governor-elect Ferguson, or should this wealth tax be something that should be passed in Washington State?
I think we have to take a look at all options. This is the deliberative legislative process. I would love to see any and all ideas that everyone has, do the pros and cons, really think again about who is this helping, who is this hurting, take a look at affordability, take a look at the regressive nature of our tax structure, and really make thoughtful policies so that we are putting our state on a good path for the future. So many of us live here because we love living here. We love working here. We love the outdoors. We love what the state has to offer. And we have to continue to do that because the quality of life in the state of Washington is tremendous. So yes, this is why we're elected, to make sure that we are deliberative, thoughtful, and take a look at everything that's on the menu. And I'll tell you, it's a buffet. And so to me, the answer is all of the above. It's not just the wealth tax. Lots of people have a lot of different ideas. And let's make sure we have a discussion about what those ideas are, who they hurt, and who they help.
But the wealth tax itself is something that you would consider?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think we have to take a look at our upside-down tax structure, take a look at who is most tax burdened and who isn't. And so when we have regular people saying, I pay a lot of taxes, the chances are you are, because a percentage of the taxes you're paying is different than the percentage of taxes our billionaires are paying. So if you feel tax burden, yes, because it is not equal.
Senator Braun.
Well, it probably doesn't shock you for me to say that I do not support the wealth tax, but I want to be clear. You know, it's kind of hard as you think about it. Most of the folks that would be affected, at least here in Washington, by this tax are not necessarily Republicans. They haven't supported the Republican efforts in our state. So I could be political about it and say, well, they're not our folks. Go ahead and tax them. But the reality is these same folks are the folks who are driving the economy that has been so robust over the last 10 years. This is a tax that has been tried in other parts of the world. In almost every case, it's been repealed because one of two things happen. One, they see negative impacts on their economy, and certainly if you think about the economy here in Washington that's so reliant on technology and the investment that goes into that, they see people go other places. And let's be clear. If you're someone who would qualify to pay this tax, you have lots of options. The idea that you would somehow choose to stay in Washington after this tax would be enacted, I think is faulty. And so whether it's because the negative impacts to the economy and the good jobs that it provides, or because it's unsustainable because the folks that pay it will make choices and can make choices to leave. We've seen this with the capital gains income tax, where the first year it came in at roughly $1 billion. This year it's going to be around $400 million because people they leave, they find ways to avoid it, and it's going to be no different here. At the same time, it's going to have very negative effects on our economy. So. And I'm not here to defend folks who qualify for the tax, but I recognize the negative impact it will have on regular folks around our state. And I think that's what Governor-elect Ferguson's looking at. He's like, this is just bad policy.
Representative Stokesbary, I'm sure you have something.
Yeah, I don't support the wealth tax. I mean, there's some practical problems. Governor Inslee's own Department of Revenue has warned him that it's probably not constitutional. There are collection problems. I mean, Senator Braun mentioned that if you have the $100 million that you might subject it to the tax, it's also pretty easy to move to another state or to hire lawyers up the street that can tell you how to structure your assets in a way that escape the tax. Also, it really betrays the lack of understanding that the government has for how the private sector works. I'm a normal person. I own a few mutual funds. You can go online and see what I own. It's not very exciting. But the kinds of people that have the money that would be captured, their stock isn't their wealth isn't all in a bunch of stocks that trade minute to minute, and at any given point in the day, you just have an objective measurement of how much they're worth. Their value is tied up in trusts and in private investments that have no readily ascertainable market value. And the government just completely misunderstands how the real world works. And it's really difficult to assign a value to something that there's no market for, no neutral way to decide the price for. But all those problems aside, I mean, it's just terrible economic policy. John mentioned that some of the wealthy people might leave, but also think about why this state is so wealthy. Representative Fitzgibbon mentioned some of the great things that we're able to do. Have an education system, have a mental health care system, have roads and transportation. We're far from perfect, but we're better than Mississippi. But think about where all of that tax revenue comes from. So much of it comes from the fact that Boeing established itself here 125 years ago. So much of it comes from the fact that Bill Gates and Paul Allen put Microsoft here 40 years ago. So much of it comes from the fact that Jeff Bezos put Amazon here 25 years ago. If you're a builder, an innovator, somebody who has an idea that will someday be worth billions and change the nature of the state's economy, why on earth would you choose to build that here in Washington when you're going to be taxed on it? Why not go set up shop in Florida or Texas? And so not only, I think, is it very short-sighted, but you're going to be taxing innovation itself, and you're going to be pushing the next generation of innovators into other environments, and we're going to lose all that opportunity that would have otherwise existed here in Washington, like we've seen with Boeing and Microsoft and Amazon. So that's why I oppose it. Senator Dhingra pointed out that we have an upside-down tax code, and lower-income people feel like they're taxed as much as millionaires. There's a solution for that. Let's lower the tax on people that work really hard for a living. If the tax is upside down, you can lower it on the people that are working hard. You don't need to just raise it on people you don't like. Let's lower taxes on the working class and fix our upside down tax code that way. That should be part of the conversation.
All right, round it out with you, Representative Fitzgibbon.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think there are some very legitimate critiques of the wealth tax proposal, as there are with any tax proposal. I don't think there's any tax that you can contemplate that we've ever debated in the legislature or outside the legislature that doesn't have downsides, and we need to be clear-eyed about what those are before we embark on what's the right combination of cuts and revenue to pursue to balance our budget. What I probably won't do is sit here on the Friday before session starts and tell you yes this, no this. We'll have a lively consideration of more options than just the one that Governor Inslee's budget was balanced on. What I can say is that we will start our contemplation of revenue with tax exemptions and loopholes that just like we scrub the state operating budget for programs that we think are no longer providing the public with what they were intended to do, we will do that with the tax code as well and try to identify, are there tax exemptions and loopholes that are not achieving the public purpose that was promised, and that probably doesn't I can tell you that definitely doesn't get you $12 billion, but it's where we should start. Before we start looking at broad-based taxes, we will look at tax exemptions and preferential rates, and then go from there. But no, I don't think there's any tax that doesn't have downsides. Even the ones that are the most broadly supported by everyone in this room, there are still downsides, and we just need to be upfront about that as we chew on what our options are.
Let's switch to education now. You know, schools, districts, parents, teachers are all going to be looking for more money during this budget year. We recently covered a story in Yelm where that community has failed to pass a couple of levies now in a row. They laid off 100 teachers, another 100 staff members. We went to a classroom that had 40 students. They don't have drama in the school anymore. The students have to get to their own way to athletic events. Major cuts that are being felt there. That's just one example. I know there are probably some parents from Seattle who have had to deal with potential school closures. That is not only happening in Seattle. What do we do about that? We all know about the paramount duty of the state, fully fund education. Let's start, I guess it's your turn this time, Representative Stokesbary, but where do you see us taking education this session?
Yeah, well, so first, let me kind of give a partial answer that connects the last question to this question. And you know, I represent a relatively rural community. It's weird because I can both see downtown Seattle from my house. Like I feel like Sarah Palin when I say that, but I can see the Columbia Tower from my backyard. But also my district goes, you know, all the way out to like Wilkeson and Carbonado, and you know, houses where if you walk on their property, they might shoot you first and ask questions second. So some very rural communities, and I've had some of my school districts fail their bonds and levies. I think an underappreciated fact by some of the folks in charge is this feeling of like powerlessness that Washingtonians, especially in some of the more rural communities, feel. For example, half of my district is in the Regional Transit Authority. When Sound Transit 3 passed, the only change to service in my community was we got one extra bus a day to Bonnie Lake. So these folks are paying $500 to $1,000 in motor vehicle excise tax and getting one bus a day for it. They're just feeling powerless from Olympia and Seattle raising taxes to the point where they have historically been very supportive of their local schools, and now they're worried that they feel like they've been paying too much taxes. They're not worried they can pay another one, and so now the bonds and levies are failing. I think us as policymakers need to understand that feeling of people feeling left behind a little better, and that will help with some of these issues with the locals not being able to pass their bonds and levies. When it comes to education funding, though, I mean, I think Republicans believe in two things. We want well-funded schools, not just because the Constitution says so, but you know, we're free market people. We believe in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and how on earth can you do that if you're not equipped for college and career? So we want schools to be well-funded, but we also want good outcomes. You need to have both. Simply funding schools but not getting good outcomes for students is a complete failure. It doesn't matter that you've succeeded in Part A because you failed in the ultimate test of Part B. So yes, we want well-funded schools, but we also want accountable schools that have good outcomes that prepare all students, regardless of zip code, for college or career. And I think that's been a little bit of what we're missing. There's certainly some areas where the legislature needs to do a better job with funding. Special education, material supplies, operating costs, transportation, I think are all areas where we've failed a little bit. But while we're having these conversations about how do we provide funding for the districts to deliver the services, we also need to be having just as many, if not more, conversations about how do we demand accountability and success from schools. And that can be measured in a lot of different ways. Part of it's test scores, part of it's graduation rates, part of it's reading levels. But too often our conversations center on the first part of the equation of how much money are we going to give to districts, and very rarely do we ask ourselves the second part, which is what kind of improved outcomes are we getting from these investments?
Representative Fitzgibbon.
Sure, yeah. I don't disagree with too much of what Rep. Stokesbary said there. Certainly we need schools to be well-resourced. We need them to be able to competitively recruit and retain educators as well as other staff. And we need them to be preparing our students to be successful in the real world, whether that's in seeking a four-year degree or going into an apprenticeship program or some other line of work. Our McCleary solution to resolve the McCleary lawsuit and to restructure school finance in our state passed in 2017, and it's showing it's being pulled at the seams right now, and I think for the first couple of years it was that the weaknesses of that structure were papered over first by just the initial influx of resources and then by COVID dollars, and now we're hearing consistently from districts, and it's not just one kind of district. It's not just your more urban districts or your more rural districts or your more progressive or more conservative or property poor, property rich. We're hearing from all school districts that they're not really able to keep pace with how much it costs. Any employer, whether a public sector or a private sector employer, will tell you it's more expensive to recruit and retain staff, to pay for their competitive wages, to provide them health care than it was, and districts are very much no exception to that. In addition to the $4 billion increase in the K-12 caseload that I talked about earlier, school districts are coming in asking for an increase in the allocation that they get from the state, even though we've increased the allocation for special ed each of the last 2 years. And a lot of the budget growth that that my Republican colleagues have talked about has just been an increase in the funds that the state has provided for special education. Districts are asking for $1 billion a year, which of course works out to $4 billion. So doubling the caseload increase in the K-12 students with an additional ask. Now I think that's going to be pretty tough for us to do. We're looking to pay for the obligations that we've already got in law before we add new ones. But our districts are squeezed right now. You see that in Seattle, but you see that in Marysville and Renton and Stehekin as well. So I don't think that this is a year that we're going to come out of session with having answered the question of what does a fully funded K-12 education system look like. I don't really think that's a question that has an answer, actually, but I don't think that we're, by anybody's definition, going to be at what full funding looks like as we try to piece together a budget solution that gets us through until next year.
Thank you. Senator Dhingra.
I'll just start off by saying children are expensive. Taking care of kids is expensive. Taking care of the elderly is expensive too, right? We have the silver tsunami, and then we have higher enrollments in our school systems. Goes back to the budget and what I'm talking about, where cuts come from and who they're going to impact. Just yesterday, we had 5 of our East Side school districts come together and have a town hall in Bellevue at the Sammamish High School. And every single school district had the same story. Just their liability insurance has skyrocketed. The amount that they pay in licensing for all the technology that our kiddos need in order to take advantage of the jobs of tomorrow, they cost a lot of money. We're not even talking about salaries of people. We're just talking about the cost of providing, just running a school. That has increased and not kept up with what we're providing them. Then we're talking about special needs children. We have started moving the needle to ensure that our special needs kids are taken care of, that they graduate with opportunities to succeed as adults. We can't put a stop to that. We can't fail another generation of special needs kids. So we have that. And then we have the transportation issue. And this is an issue that we hear about in Seattle. We hear about it on the east side. We hear about it on the east side of the state. These are real issues that schools have just to maintain what they're currently doing. And so, yes, we have to do something to help them. To me, we cannot leave next session without putting in more resources for special needs kids. We cannot fail the next generation. So, question again arises, how do we get there? And that's what you're going to see in the next few months.
Thank you, Senator Braun.
All right, I love being the last one. I just want to point out a few things to help you shape your understanding of the challenge we have. First, we've talked about maintenance supplies, operating costs, it's materials to keep the lights on in the building. A couple folks mentioned that. Absolutely a problem across our state. It is not a symptom, it's not a result of a flawed solution to McCleary in 2017. It's the fact that energy costs in most of our school districts have doubled or tripled. That's a policy decision. It's largely based on the clean energy standard and the cap and trade system, which the voters have decided we want to keep. But it adds to the cost. It's not something that was inherently built in. It's something that was decided after they drove up the cost. Insurance in our school districts have gone up 200 plus% in most cases. This is also driven by policy decisions made in the legislature. So these operating costs have gone up because of decisions we made in Olympia. And we in some cases, we can change those decisions, but if we decide not to, we have an obligation, both constitutionally and morally, to cover the cost. We have to recognize when we make decisions that drive up costs for everybody else, if it drives up our cost and K-12 is our responsibility, we need to cover the cost. Drew, you mentioned levies not passing. And I thought other Drew made a good explanation of why that's not happening. But I think the thing that gets passed over here is that shouldn't make a difference when it comes to funding schools. If we are relying on local levies to fund our schools, we're getting it wrong. The state is responsible. It's our paramount duty to fund these schools. If districts can't deliver basic education services because their levy doesn't pass, then we are failing in Olympia. We have to recognize that. The next thing I want to point out is when you talk about underfunding for schools, you really have to put it in perspective. There's two things you should understand. One is our teachers are very well paid. According to recent studies, they're top 5 in the country. One study even has them as the best compensated teachers in the country. That's something we should be proud of. Our teachers should be well paid, but understand we don't have a funding issue when it comes to paying for teachers. Our funding issue is how you deliver all the other stuff, and that part we're falling well short of the mark. And then the last thing I'll say is, how do we get here? Again, go back to the McCleary days in 2017. Education funding for K-12 basic education was 52% of the budget. 52% of the budget. Today it's 43% of the budget. Well, what's happened is over the last 7 years, we haven't prioritized education. It should be no surprise when you don't prioritize education, as the budget grows, you're going to fall short over time. So we do need to put money in. We need to do it in a way that certainly continues good pay for teachers, but also protects money that can actually be delivered to students for services, whether it's through the Learning Assistance Program, whether it's English as a second language, or any other program that helps students with special needs. We need to protect that to make sure we deliver those services. It doesn't just go to additional teacher pay because we think we got that covered. And we need to prioritize education, not number 2 or number 3 or number 4, but number 1, because that's the way the Constitution does it.
Thank you, Senator. Angela.
All right, let's talk about housing affordability. I'm going to start with you, Representative Fitzgibbon, but I recall earlier in the conversation, Senator Braun, you said you were not for rent stabilization plans, just not on your radar.
It's on my radar.
Well, on your radar, but has a target on it more so than a check mark next to it. So there was some progress made during the last session talking about this. Representative Fitzgibbon, if not rent control, what are other ways that the legislature can hone in on addressing this concern of housing affordability?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge enough problem, for most households. Housing is their biggest expense, whether that's a mortgage or a rental payment. It's their biggest expense. We made some remarkable progress, particularly on tackling the housing supply part of the equation in the last 2 years, legalizing townhouses and duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes in all urban areas of the state. Reducing permit requirements for building homes, reducing environmental review requirements for new housing developments, reducing liability requirements for condominium construction, legalizing accessory dwelling units, and removing some of the things that cities can require you to have, expensive things that they can require you to have in order to build an accessory dwelling unit. Really significant regulatory streamlining to make it easier for home builders to build homes, and I think I'm very excited about that. Real change in the conversation since when I arrived in the legislature, and I'm really happy to see that. I do think that there's more we can do on that front. I think there's more we can do to address housing supply by making it easier. For example, there's a bipartisan bill that we passed out of the House each of the last 2 years by a Republican representative, Representative Barkas, to legalize lot splitting, to make it easier to split a lot in an urban area to build 2 homes instead of 1. I think we're going to prioritize that again. That's great. It's great to address this acute housing shortage that we have in this state. It doesn't immediately help the people who are living on the edge today. People who are renting and are seeing 15 or 20 or 25% rent increases year over year. That's the most common time for somebody to become homeless, is when they see a rent increase that they can't afford, and then they lose that rental. They lose that home because they can't afford the rent increase, and that's often when we see people head into homelessness. Now, they may not go right out onto the streets. They may start by sleeping on a couch of a friend or a family member, and then or maybe they're sleeping in their car. Maybe then they end up, maybe they lose their car, end up in a shelter, and we see people enter into homelessness. There's a reason that the homelessness problem is so acute in expensive housing markets like Washington and California, compared to places that have far higher rates of drug addiction than we have, like Ohio and West Virginia, but don't have the same housing shortage that we have. The thing that is most clearly correlated with homelessness is people losing the ability to afford a place to live. So that's where I think capping rent increases at 7% a year is not unreasonable. I think there's evidence that trying to freeze rents in place and never allowing them to increase again has unintended consequences. We've seen that in San Francisco. We've seen that in New York. However, I think saying that 7% a year is enough for a landlord to recoup the investments that they have made into that property, to me, that's reasonable. And to me, that provides predictability for people who are already most likely to be teetering on the edge of homelessness. So I think that we can address our housing supply problems by making it easier to build homes and cap the speed at which rents can increase at a reasonable level. And I think that those are both things that we will do this year.
All right, we're going to swing this direction. So, Representative Stokesbary, rent stabilization, yes or no? And if not, what else needs to be considered?
Yeah, I'm a no for the reason that Senator Braun kind of outlined at the beginning. I echo Representative Fitzgibbon. I want to call you Sullivan. Don't tell Pat.
I won't be too offended.
Yes, Republicans are concerned. We, like I said at the beginning of my answer, we want to make sure Washington is affordable for everybody, particularly working class families, where meeting housing ends can be a struggle. But I do think that rent control or rent stabilization is short-sighted. When I was asked about this yesterday, I gave the example of when my first job out of college, my boss used to use this phrase, penny wise, pound foolish, and I'd never heard it before, and it took me a while to realize what that meant. But I think this policy is one that's penny wise and pound foolish. Yes, in the short term, it probably will help some folks to have some certainty that rent would only increase by 7%, and I am completely sympathetic to that. The challenge, though, is over the medium and long term. The problem is a lack of supply, and I'll get to that in a second. And Representative Fitzgibbon did a great job talking about that, and there is a lot of agreement there. The underlying problem is a lack of supply. We have the fewest number of housing units per family of any state in the country. And that was a study done by the Democrat lieutenant governor. It's not a partisan talking point. We just have the fewest housing units of any state in the country. So we need more supply. So the answer to bringing down the long-term rental rates and housing purchase prices is by building more supply. The laws of supply and demand aren't some right-wing fever dream of a University of Chicago economist. That's just how the real world works. And if we want to bring down the price, we can either force everybody to move to Idaho or we can build more supply. And I don't think one of those would pass constitutional muster, so we should build more supply. How do we get more supply built? Well, we have to attract the private sector and make it worth their while to build here. We can't do it with the public sector alone. John will probably answer with the actual math, but it would take something like 40 or 50 years to have enough money to just build enough public housing to solve the problem that we need. So we need the public sector to do this. But if you are putting caps on how much they can charge in rent, that will make Washington look like a much less favorable investment. So if you're a capital allocator making a decision, you're not going to pick Washington to put your capital. You're going to invest that money in complexes in Florida, in Texas, in places that don't face these kinds of restrictions. So I understand the sort of short-term desire to want to provide stabilization. My nervousness is over the long run, it'll mean less supply, less new units built, and we'll be looking back 20 years from now wondering why rent is still so high. It's because we drove all the new capital out of the state and we didn't build nearly as many housing units as we needed. I am heartened by the degree of bipartisanship on the question of supply. I also think when I got elected 10 years ago, it wasn't really like this, but I think we've made a lot of progress. Joe mentioned Representative Barkas from my caucus. He worked very closely with Representative Bateman from Olympia, who's now going to be Senator Bateman, on a really strong bipartisan basis. Yes, the bill's messy. We talked about like there's trade-off with taxes. There's also a trade-off with housing policy between wanting to build more and wanting to understand, wanting to defer to local control. Olympia doesn't always know better about like my cities than my cities know about my cities. But so it's a balancing act. But I think overall we're making good progress. There's plenty more to be done. There's a lot splitting bill that passed the House but not the Senate. There's a rural ADU bill that passed the Senate but not the House. I think there's still more progress that can be done, but that's the problem we need to attack. Aggressively figure out ways we can induce more supply to be built in Washington. Big houses, small houses, rural houses, urban houses, single-family homes, townhomes, condos, you name it. I'm going to stop being Dr. Seuss now.
All right, Senator Braun, we know you're not for rent stabilization. What do you think can help us address this issue of housing affordability?
So I want to just restate what I said earlier because I think it's important. We don't disagree that there's a problem. We think this is a very real problem in all the communities across the state. Increasing rents are a challenge. What we disagree on is this the way to solve it? And Representative Stokesbary talked about a lot of the concerns there, why this won't work. And here's the thing, is we got into this situation over many years. Some would say decades. If you go back and look, because of our regulatory situation, we haven't built the number of houses that we need as a population. We are kidding ourselves if we think there's going to be a quick solution. There's not going to be. Now we can do things in the short term that help. For instance, renters who are having trouble with next month's rents because they had to repair their car or they had some unexpected expense or injury, that the state can step in, and we do, and we can beef those programs up to make sure if they're in danger of losing their house in the short term, we can and should help with that. But we're not going to be able to magically wave a wand and say, okay, all of a sudden we have a bunch of housing available. It just doesn't work. Drew mentioned affordable housing, and you put me on the spot to do some math. I don't know if you're interested in that, but affordable housing as funded by the state is an important part of the plan, but it's only a very small part of the plan. And I'll show you. So this current biennium, we've spent about $800 million. $800 million is a lot of money, right, for affordable housing. Now, not all that goes towards actual housing. A bunch of it is services and everything. Let's just optimistically say it all gets spent on new housing. And then let's optimistically say you can buy a new dwelling for $400,000. Now, you can't actually do that, but it makes the math easier, right? So $800 million divided by $400,000 is $2,000, right? That means in a 2-year period, we spent that. If those optimistic assumptions were true, we would build 2,000 homes in 2 years, 1,000 a year. We're 300,000 homes short. That's a 300-year solution. The point is, it's an important part of the solution, but it's not a very big part of the solution. We have to engage the private sector. The only way we dig our way out of this is if we have the private sector investing in housing in the state of Washington. And to do that, we have to recognize that capital markets have choices. We may not like that, but it's the fact. They could choose to build here, and frankly, many of them want to build here, or they could choose to build in Texas or Tennessee or pick your state. And they're going to look at what's the regulatory. So we are going to put in danger the capital investment in our state by putting in place a rent control or rent stabilization bill that's going to diminish the investment in our state, going to drive down the number of homes built in our state, and can create a much larger problem. So you'll have pockets of housing. With the rent stabilization bill, you'll have pockets of housing that are inexpensive because that person stayed in their home and they could only raise the rent a certain amount per year forever. But guess what? As soon as they move out, the landlord under this bill is allowed to raise it back up, and now there's a much smaller supply, so they can raise it even higher. We don't solve the problem, and we shouldn't think we're going to solve the problem immediately. We have to put in place, and I think I'm personally very encouraged. Representative Fitzgibbon mentioned some of the great bills that have been worked on in a bipartisan manner in the last 2 years. I'm excited to have Senator-elect Bateman come over from the House. I think she's going to be an important addition to the team. She has a great reputation for working on a bipartisan manner on housing, but we got to be much more aggressive, and we have to go places so far we have not been willing to go before. 4 issues we have to address to build more housing. regulatory environment, and we've done some of that. We need to do more, and a lot of that involves working with our local governments. Most of this permitting is actually done at the local level, and they're struggling with abiding by state rules, but we can help them. Energy. Our energy standards continue to change and get more and more expensive. We need to let them, first, we need to stop making it more expensive. And second, we need to stabilize it so builders can figure out how to meet the energy code in an affordable way. And then the third and fourth are really the same thing, but it's two different ways. How do we find more places to build? One is density, and we worked 2 years ago on what was referred to then as the middle housing bill, but basically allowed us to build townhouses or higher density in all parts of our state and urban areas. That's a good bill, bipartisan bill. The other is we have to open up new lands. We have to address the Growth Management Act, and we don't need to undo it, but we need to reform it in a way that actually allows cities to plan for the growth they're seeing. They just can't do it. It's a 10-year cycle. Imagine anything else you buy in today's world that you say, hey, I need this tomorrow, and the supplier says, I get it, I know you really need it, I'm on a 10-year cycle, I'll get back to you. It just doesn't work. We have to make it more nimble. We have to make it more flexible. We have to get past this ironclad barrier to new buildable land if we're going to address this issue.
Senator.
So I think you'll hear agreement that we need more housing. We need more supply. But you have to take a look at what all is being supplied and make sure that you're able to fit people in different categories of that supply. You need high-end houses, you need affordable housing, and you need everything in between. I'll just say I've been really proud of the city of Redmond, city of Kirkland. They've been doing incredible jobs when it comes to density, talking about transit-oriented development. And that is part and parcel of it. You have to have partnerships all across that spectrum. But rent stabilization, and this is different from rent control, and the very smart people who can come up with very complex policies. You can have exceptions in saying new construction, maybe you're not subject to rent stabilization for the first 10 years, maybe not for the first 15 years. So you can continue to charge $4,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment in Redmond. And then maybe that kicks in after that. There are dials. There are ways of taking a look at how do you have that private-public partnership where people in the private sector are incentivized to build here, to provide housing, and making sure that they can make their profit, but also making sure that you have affordability built into it. In Redmond, we now have higher buildings because guess what? If you're going to provide a certain percentage that's affordable, you get to go up higher and get 2 more floors on your building. So these are things that are solvable. You just need to make sure people are at the table really talking about how can we thread that needle. And I do believe we can thread that needle. We are a market that people want to come and build at. They do make money when they're here. But we have to make sure that we can continue to thread that needle. It's not 1 and 0. We really can work this to make sure we're getting the supply we need and making sure people can afford to live in the apartments once they get in.
Excellent. We have one more of these long format questions, and then we will do our speed round, and then we will get to the audience questions. So if you have a thought in your mind, start preparing to speak on that one. So the last thing we wanted to bring up was another funding situation. The gas tax is not making what it used to. Transportation, there are lots of projects that are coming in over budget. We all know some of the reasons there, inflation and labor costs. But the gas tax isn't doing what it used to. And there will be a bill, Representative Fye told us yesterday, to start transitioning us to a pay-by-the-mile system called the road usage charge. He says he'd like to start it as a voluntary program for electric vehicle owners and hybrid owners and then phase it in over a few years. But he says what we're doing is not working and we need to replace the gas tax. It would not be a double tax. There would be rebates issued, and there's lots of details to work out, as you all know. But what we've relied on for 100 years isn't working anymore. So I think we've gone around. So maybe, Senator, we'll start with you again. Do you like the idea of transitioning away from the traditional gas tax and going to a pay-by-the-mile RUC system?
So we do have to look at options away from the gas tax because we have been encouraging EVs and we do want another energy options. I will say I am not a fan of the road usage tax. I think there are a lot of problems with it that have to be worked out because, you know, the people who end up using the roads a lot are the people who can't afford to live in the areas in which they work. So I greatly worry about the impact on people who are in the landscaping business, who are gardeners, who are baristas. I even worry about the teachers. I know Senator Braun talked about how well paid they are in this state. Einstein Elementary School, the principal used to change every 2 years because the principal was commuting an hour to get to Redmond to teach at that school. And so it comes back to, again, who is going to be paying this tax? Who's going to be impacted most? So we do have to take a look at how we pay for transportation because the gas tax is not going to cut it. But I got to say, not a fan, open to learning, because I always think we have to really work through a lot of these details and try to get creative on how we find solutions. But we'll just have to see where we go, but not a fan of the road usage tax.
Senator Braun, are you a fan?
I am not a fan. I certainly respect Representative Fye, and he's a serious person, but I think he's going to have trouble. I think you have folks who object on both sides of the political spectrum. There's a lot of challenges with the road usage charge. And I want to say, we talked earlier about the operating budget and the challenges related to the operating budget. I actually think the transportation budget challenges are harder than the operating budget, because what we've done is over the last 3+ decades, we've had an over-reliance on a very high gas tax. We still have, I think, the third highest gas tax in the country, and on an over-reliance on bonding. So we have we're very heavily bonded against that gas tax. And then you add the Climate Commitment Act that added 50 cents a gallon, and we really have nowhere to go with the gas tax. There's no future with the gas tax as funding for a whole bunch of reasons. I think, and we've promoted for a number of years now, we need to do what many states in the union do, which is to use some of their operating revenue to support investment in transportation. We've promoted the idea of using the sales tax on motor vehicles to cover transportation. There's some nexus there, but really there's a dozen different ways you could do it. And we didn't invent this idea. Most states do this already, and it provides an ongoing steady stream for transportation. Because one thing I think hopefully we all agree on is we need a world-class transportation system if we're going to be successful. And even like the investments that are here in King County, I don't represent King County, but I know 405 is important to our economy and affects the folks down in Lewis County. The trestle affects the folks in Lewis County. The bridge over I-5 to Portland affects the folks up here. It's all tied together. We need a world-class system. We need a stable long-term source. I think we're in tough shape, as you might imagine, this year to say, we're going to move some, we only have a $10 billion deficit, we're going to move some stuff over the transportation. So I think that's a challenge, but I also think you could do it in a stair-step way, where you say, over the next decade, we're going to step in 10% of the sales tax on motor vehicles into transportation and build up to that and plan for that. If we did that, I think it's enormously achievable and affordable, and it would get us on a much better path to do both big projects and the maintenance that we can all sense we're behind on if you drive I-5.
Thank you. Representative Stokesbary.
Yeah, I'm also not a big fan of the road usage charge. I think for me, I would have kind of 3 preconditions, and they're pretty absolute. And if the plan doesn't include those 3, I'd be pretty firmly against it. One is it can't be duplicative. We would need to offset the gas tax. We already have among the highest gas tax in the country. We can't add a road usage charge on top of it. Now, I appreciate that Representative Fye's proposal would sort of be replacement and not duplicative, so that's one of them. The second would be that it needs to be protected by the 18th Amendment to the state's constitution. Right now, that requires gas tax revenue be spent on roads. It's not fair to tell people that their money is going to something and then for it to go to something else. That's just not the right thing to do, and it's oftentimes illegal. So we have protected in our constitution the money that you pay in gas tax to ensure that it goes to build and replace the roads you're driving your car on. So a road usage charge, I think, in my mind, we'd need to make sure it was 18th Amendment protected as well, so that in 10 years, our replacements couldn't say, hey, look at all that road usage tax money. Let's go do something else with it besides building more roads and replacing the roads we have. My third one is very similar to a comment Senator Dhingra made, which is that it can't disproportionately burden working class families. I represent, like I said, you can see Seattle from my house. My neighbors are, like, one of them's a paralegal at K&L Gates up the hill. I got a teacher in the Bellevue School District, a police officer up in Senator Dhingra's district in Redmond. None of them want to spend an hour and a half driving on I-5 or 405. They live in Auburn and work in Bellevue or Seattle because they can't afford to live in Bellevue or Seattle. They would love to spend more time with their families and less time on the car and polluting less carbon into the atmosphere. That'll make Joe very happy. They just can't afford to do it. And so the idea that you would penalize them by making them pay even more to do something they don't want to do in the first place, I think is kind of mind-boggling. So if there's a way to figure out to do it that relieves the burden on working class families, we need to figure out a way to do that. But right now, I don't think it gets to all three. Maybe it gets to one of the three. There's other kind of implementation problems, right? Like right now, none of us fill out a form to pay the gas tax. It just is built in to the price when we buy gas. So when your Department of Revenue administering the tax, you only have like a couple hundred or maybe 1,000 or so taxpayers you have to interact with. It's the gas dealers that are paying the tax. If suddenly it changes where all of us are like filing forms or something, and now they've got like 7 million people to deal with, that just is really complicated administratively, and we don't have a good system set up to do that. Maybe it's solvable, but it's hard. So I will agree with what Senator Braun said. I think the much better solution is you take some of the operating budget money and you put it into the transportation budget. We have one of the highest gas taxes in the country. Like, yes, I don't love our Department of Transportation. You know, here in Seattle, the 99 project, 520 project have been behind schedule, over budget. Guess what? We're not the only state in the country that has a DOT that can't deliver projects on time and on budget. All 50 states deal with that. Why do we pay the most? It's not because DOT is uniquely bad. I don't think they're great, but I don't think they're uniquely bad. It's because we're one of the only states that doesn't fund transportation through its operating budget or capital budget. I think we can get there. And unlike the gas tax or the road usage charge, it's inflation linked because it's a sales tax that's a percentage of the vehicle price. So the vehicle price will rise over time with inflation. So that means the collections rise over time. The problem with gas tax is it's a fixed dollar amount. The problem with the road usage charge is it's a percentage of it's a fixed dollar amount based on miles driven. So we'll have to constantly be raising it just to chase inflation. You solve that problem if you use operating budget money and put that into the transportation budget.
Representative Fitzgibbon.
I think you're hearing why the road usage charge has not yet been enacted. I've been in office for 14 years, and we've been talking about it the whole time I've been in, and it's not the law yet here or in any state. And I think you're just hearing, you know, the array of concerns from across the political spectrum that people have about it. I'm probably the most favorable of any of the four of us up here about a road usage charge, and I still have some sort of preconditions for the circumstances in which I'd be okay with supporting it. I think it makes sense for electric cars because they don't pay gas tax. I think it would make sense for electric cars as a replacement for the very steep and punitive car tabs that we charge electric cars. That was a difficult compromise that was made a few years back in order to get some other electric car incentives passed. I would never support a system in which a Hummer and a Volt are paying the same amount per mile. I think that's the externalities, the damage it causes to the roadway, the damage it causes to air quality, to climate, of a gas guzzler is just orders of magnitude higher than it is for an electric car. And so I think that's one of the upsides of the gas tax is that it does charge more to vehicles that pollute more. I think in any case, even if we were all really excited about a road usage charge, it's not really a solution to our near-term transportation budget shortfall because it takes a couple of years to get a system like that up and running. We don't have good options for how to fill that shortfall because the only revenue streams that we currently have that provide sort of the order of magnitude of money that you'd need to meet the shortfall are vehicle fees and the gas tax, both of which are very politically challenging for obvious reasons. I will say, speaking for Joe Fitzgibbon only, not speaking for the House Democrats, but my constituents on Vashon Island pay through the nose when they get on and off that island using the state ferry system or using a King County passenger ferry. I think that we should price more of our roadways so that you pay a toll to cross the 520 bridge, but you don't pay a toll to cross the I-90 bridge. I think for Senator Dhingra's constituents, that probably, for some of them, that probably feels inequitable that their primary roadway connection into Seattle is tolled, whereas the one south of it is free. I think that we should look at that. But I also know that that's a different political conversation depending on what part of the state you represent. We don't have good choices here.
Thank you. Now we'd like to get to our speed round. So under your chairs, you'll see the thumbs up and thumbs downs. I don't think this is the favorite part of the day for our legislators, but sorry, Senator.
Go for it, Drew.
So we were just talking about Representative Fye. He also threw out another maybe not so popular idea. Oh, by the way, so green is thumbs up, orange is thumbs down. We used to have a waffle option, but we're gonna be tough on you.
Make you
No,
commit.
no easy outs here. Sideways, yeah. Hey. All right. So Representative
always
Fye
creative.
said he might even propose a gas tax increase this year to help pay for some of those road projects. Would you vote for a gas tax this session? Interesting. All right.
All right, next question. Does the state need more graffiti fighting drones?
A recent study said that the drone that DOT was a Andrew
been
Barkus
effective.
bill, I
I
believe.
didn't even know those existed until 10 seconds ago, and I'm already in favor.
Yeah. Andrew Barkus bill. It was a study, and DOT sang its praises. But they're not cheap, but they're effective, and they're a lot safer than making men and women paint over. So, do we have an answer? You need more
I had
info.
not heard of this. until
Okay.
then, so-
It's a good thing.
I'll send
trust
you
me.
our story.
Oh,
it
I
was
hear
one of
it.
our highest clicked on stories last year. It's a machine that goes up and sprays over graffiti. I'll send that to you.
All right.
this
let's
one's
see.
mine. Sorry.
Yeah, go for it, please.
We heard it earlier. Is this the year that the drunk driving level is lowered to BAC 05? I guess, would you support that? So, well, I guess there's two questions there. Would you vote for lowering the BAC level to 0.05? Okay, and that is a green for you.
It's going to be scheduled in Lawn Justice very shortly.
All right, we'll be there for that.
All right, ticket writing speed cameras are coming to work zones. Should those be expanded to all state and federal highways?
In work zones or?
They're currently going through work zones, but should it be expanded to all parts of our highway system? Okay, we're split on that.
So you sideways on that?
I am. I
Oh, okay,
struggle
that's a
with.
side.
I
You
struggle
found a
with
way to make a
cameras.
waffle out of that. That's good. All right, I told
I'm
you.
very creative.
You're good. Should all students in the state receive free lunches?
Okay. And that's on that.
Something I heard yesterday, that's not cheap, correct? Mr. Math, you know how much that would cost?
It's very expensive. I think the all-in price is several $100 million. But the thing is, drawing a line, we struggle drawing a line. Why would we do this for some kids and not others? And it just makes sense. Now, can we do it this year? I don't know, but we should do it. Absolutely.
Okay, interesting. Our first applause question. We saved this one for the end. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Here's a question you'll like, Senator. Is this the year that we stop making the switch 2 times a year for the clocks? Big thumbs up here. Okay.
Interesting. That's an interesting. An issue that's come up is handling juvenile offenders. Senator Braun, I know it's in your district, Green Hill there. Should the state stop holding these juvenile offenders who have sentences that go up into their mid-20s? Should we put those folks into adult facilities as a way to perhaps save some funding?
Actually, split.
Okay, that's an interesting one.
Good. That's good to hear. Is this going to be the year when work will finally be done to find an alternative commercial airport to SeaTac? Is this year?
It's a,
It's,
Are you
well,
saying if we
there's-
support it, if it will happen?
I think
let's start with, do you support it? Okay.
Where is it? And
Well, that's the question.
not in your
That's the
backyard.
question. Right. All right, and do you think it'll happen this
the
year?
Muckleshoot tribe and I will make sure it's not in Auburn, but if it's not in Auburn, then I don't care where it is.
All right, fair enough. Fair
That's-
enough.
that's
But I'll
gonna be
let you round it
someone
out,
else-
Drew.
Someone else's mess. Should flavored vapes and menthol cigarettes be banned in the state of Washington? All right, interesting.
I'll let you ask the last question because I know it's one of your favorites.
Oh, who knows? Is this the year the Sonics come back to Seattle? Does anyone know? Does anyone know?
Oh, another?
Oh, wow.
Nope.
I mean, you want a real answer? or
I don't know. You never know. All right, I had some others. Maybe we'll get to those at the end. But we do want to open it up to the audience. We appreciate you guys being here. And I know probably some interesting ideas come up after we've heard from these folks.
Just going to steal one of your mics. Thank you. So who has a question? I'll run around and give you the mic.
I'll say that I didn't really want to go first. I thought maybe you'd pick somebody else first, but Hi, I'm Dave Keenan. I'm the Chief Judge of the Maline Regional Justice Center for the King County Superior Court. And Green Hill just came up, that's my question is about Green Hill. So for those of you who don't know, it's run by the Department of Children, Youth, and Family. It's where we house young people who've been convicted of very serious crimes. And I visited Green Hill twice in the last 2 months. Each time it was about 30% overcrowded. Staff is stressed. Youth are not getting the services that they need. And so just if anybody on the podium wants to answer, where does that fall in your priorities? Because I've seen drafts of bills that might reduce the inputs into juvenile rehabilitation, but also DCYF's decision package that I think would seek some funding, for example, the facility at Stafford Creek.
Well, Green Hill's in my district, so I'll be happy to take that on. This is a real crisis with Green Hill, and I think Echo Glen is not in quite the same situation, but they're not doing well. We are very much overcrowded, roughly 240 folks right now. Safe, according to the DCYF, is 180. If you talk to staff, they think safe is much lower than that, possibly 120. I think there's some reasonable people could disagree in that area, but clearly overcrowded right now. We got to do something, and the reality is the promise of the JR 25 policy that they're trying to implement is not being implemented because in large measure these residents are locked down. They're not getting the services that were intended by the law or which would get them hopefully on a better track and back into civil society and productive. So we're failing on both ends right now. We have to do something. I think the answer, especially given our fiscal challenges, is we have to provide some mechanism. I mean, my preference it would actually be to undo JR 25, start over, try to find a way that may achieve the same ends, but an actual that can be actually implemented effectively by DCYF. There are other examples around the country where they're dealing with smaller populations and they have a better chance to implement it. But in the meantime, I think politically undoing it is unlikely, so we need to give some relief to the facilities to make sure they can make reasonable and responsible decisions about how they reduce population to get it to a safe level so that staff is safe, so that the residents are safe, and so they can deliver the services that will hopefully get these young people back on a productive life. And we are not doing that right now. Long way to go, but I do think there's a path. We can address that in this session.
And I'll agree with Senator Braun. The end result is that every single one of us wants these young adults to leave these facilities and have a path to success. That is the goal, and it's not a political goal. I think everyone agrees with that. The issue is, how do we get there? You have to address overcrowding, and I think you have to have DOC play a role with Department of Corrections and Department of Youth and Family Services. Because DCYF is not in a position to handle that population on their own, and we saw that happening. When DOC came in to work with them and partner with them to help stabilize the environment, we saw better results. So I think Senator Braun is right. We have to make sure we make changes so that we are indeed creating an environment where we can do the rehabilitation, where we can provide education and resources so that these young adults, when they leave, they actually are successful adults. And since the judge spoke up, I'll just say, the other issue driving our budget is courts. Judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and we haven't even talked about standards there for defense caseload. Talk about something that's going to impact the budget dramatically.
Okay. Janet Kelly with Puget Sound Energy in my day job. My part-time volunteer job is helping make sure that our kids have enough funding at their schools. The bonds currently require 60% passage from voters, and last November we saw 14 bonds on the ballot. 4 passed. 10 of those that didn't pass got, 8 of them, passed with more than 50%. So there is a majority of voters right now in many of the districts that do support additional funding for schools for the capital projects. So I'm just wondering, maybe putting you on the spot, asking with your voting buttons, if there was a bill to reduce the passage requirement of school bonds from 60% to a simple majority, would you vote for that?
100%. We do have bills that are changing it to 55 because we think maybe there's a path to 55 instead of 60 or 50, so more on that.
Yeah, and I just, to explain a little bit, you have to understand, constitutionally, we don't do bonds at the state level without 60%. And the reason I think it was written that way is simply because when you do a bond, you're talking about a very long-term commitment for taxpayers. And to have a higher standard for that longer-term commitment, I think is reasonable. The challenge, and I live in a very rural district, we have this exact challenge in many cases. The district I live in failed their bond 3 times. They passed it most recently, but they had to work hard to go build trust with the community. And in the long term, that has worked out much better. You know, as folks who are concerned about property taxes, they now know when part of that, when they pay that, is for the bond, and they understand what it's doing for their school system. So some of it just takes. It is hard. I completely agree with that, but I think it's hard on purpose. In my experience, districts that take that serious, go out and educate their voters, make the case, help them understand, they will get support. It's just not automatic, where levies historically, not so much in recent years, have been more automatic. Bonds are not automatic. You got to go make your case. And if you make your case, even in poor rural districts, you can get it passed.
Hi, my name's Tina. I work at a affordable housing, permanent supportive housing program. I have a shelter in Auburn, actually, so I have programs from Shoreline to Auburn right now. I have 10 of them. I think one of my questions is that, so housing you guys address as an issue, and we need to make it affordable, and there needs to be incentives. And I just want to invite the bigger spectrum, right? Like, so I have a 28-year-old who can't afford to move out, but in my work life, like there's a big spectrum. There's 28-year-old professionals with educations and whatnot, but then there's also another group of people who are most vulnerable. The majority of the people I house are over the age of 55 with 0 to 30% local area median income. So they're not paying high rents, or even the affordable rents are too expensive. And so just opening up the spectrum when you're making decisions to remember the people who don't live in your neighborhood and the needs that they have, and the cost. When you talk about teachers making incomes, well, that's great, but you know, the cost of living here is not really equitable to what their income is. Otherwise, my daughter wouldn't still be living at home as a teacher. So I would just want to invite you to continue to open that spectrum, and then also consider what you guys are going to be doing about advocating for mental health. Our mental health system is critically broken, and we are letting people hemorrhage through behavioral health concerns and health issues. It is not a choice or a bad behavior. This is a health issue that should be seen as a public health concern. So also please consider that, or what thoughts do you have on that matter?
Well, I'll just take the behavioral health one. I know that Washington has not been doing a great job. We have been moving up, and I will tell you that the 988 bill that Rep. Orwell and I worked on, that is now the national model on how crisis work should be done. And this is when, when we talk about the budget, I mentioned mental health. We cannot pause on the work that we're doing to help the most vulnerable. Because when you hit that pause button, it doesn't just take 2 or 3 years for it to recover. It can take 5 to 10 years for that work to recover. And we are on a path where Washington is making such tremendous strides in mental health, but we have a long ways to go. And yes, that will always be on the forefront of the work that I do in making sure we're not pausing in creating more capacity for mental health, especially for our students.
Yeah, I'd just add that this effort has been a bipartisan effort. It started, at least in my experience, in 2014, and it's a long-term problem that grew over time, not dissimilar from the housing problem. We let it atrophy over time and didn't really start to address it, from my perspective at least, till around 2014. To Senator Dhingra's credit, when the majority switched in the state Senate, she was very inclusive, and we continued to work on it in a bipartisan way. And it's very frustrating to all of us. It's not going as fast as we would like it, but our long-term solution, which is to have access to all levels of behavioral health and substance abuse in communities around the state, is a very slow process in terms of identifying them, funding them, building them out, staffing. But we're making, again, I'm not saying we're not anxious to go faster, but we are making some good progress. The Northwest campus for the University of Washington came online earlier this year, is going to help us tremendously. We have had some startup challenges, but that's going to be great. Western State's going to be back online. We have community mental health facilities or substance abuse facilities, transitional housing, literally coming online all over the state, including in my district, and I would guess in all 4 of our districts. So we are making progress, and then when we're there, I think we'll have a world-class system when it comes to mental health and behavioral health. But I share your frustration in the interim very much.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I mean, not only do I agree with what you said and, share my colleagues' sort of concern about us going fast enough, but for what it's worth, the bottleneck here is not political. It's not that Democrats have one idea and Republicans have another idea and we're fighting at each other on this one. Like, there is like pretty good broad bipartisan consensus here that like the Western State Hospital model of doing things is woefully antiquated, and the community-based solution that Senator Braun was talking about is the direction we need to go. So the bottleneck is not political deadlock. The bottleneck really isn't even funding that much. I mean, yeah, it'd be nice to have more funding. The real substantive bottlenecks are physical in nature. Like, it just takes time to build these facilities, and they're people-based. We don't have enough people to staff these facilities. So, I mean, those are the more acute problems. It's not a lack of political will, and it's not really even that, like, we don't have the money to spend. We just can't build them and staff them fast enough. Not to say that we shouldn't keep trying and pushing, like Senator Braun said, but in the scheme of things, I would those are better bottlenecks to have than we just can't get our act together.
I will add, we need to fix the Medicaid reimbursement rate. The providers are not getting paid enough. You cannot keep people in the system because the burnout is high. There is a huge money problem too.
In Medicaid.
So, I think as you heard from all 3 of my colleagues, right, we have very substantially increased the resources, the state resources going into behavioral health in terms of Medicaid rates, in terms of settling lawsuits like the True Blood lawsuit, which isn't totally settled yet, but we're making progress, expanding the physical space, building new beds, trying to staff those beds, as you heard from Rep. Stokesbary. It takes a long time. It takes a while to get people interested in that line of work, to get them trained, and to keep them in that line of work. All of those things do cost money. I do think that we are starting and will start to see more of those investments pay off. The one thing I wanted to add is that when you hear this number, only 42% of the state budget is going to K-12 education, well, we've increased funding for K-12 education year over year, every year. The reason it's gone down to 42% is because we're spending more on behavioral health than we used to. And so that is a stat that I think is maybe not telling the story that sometimes it sounds like it's telling. We have not cut funding for education. We're just spending more on other things, and by far the biggest thing that we've added more dollars into is behavioral health.
Hello, my name is Allison, and I have a son. I'm a mother of a son, an adult son who lived in an adult family home, more than one, and I would like to see it addressed. If my son wasn't in the home, I would have not known that some of the homes are definitely hiring nurses who are not trained and they are not qualified, and some of them really don't have the documentation to live here in our state. And because the adult family home owners knows this, they hold a monopoly over many of the care nurses. I personally had to intervene a couple of times to let the owner know that you can work this person nonstop 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They need to get a break. They need to have some time off. And another thing that I noticed is that they will take in far more patients than one nurse can take care of. And my son, who himself was suffering a major disability, that is why the advice was given to me he couldn't live by himself and he should be at an adult family home. But my own son had to assist many of the nurses to take care of patients. And I find the reason, I talked to the owner, why are you doing these things? You can use the excuse, well, I give this nurse opportunity, she doesn't have no papers, she could get deported and this and that and the other, I could deport her. I think these things are unfair. I have lodged complaint. I have met with some of the people, I guess, and from DSHS who overseeing them to bring over my complaint and to let them know this is going on. A lot of information received, promise of going to look into it, and that persists in more than one adult family home, because I moved my son from one of the home, hoping the second home would have a different outcome, and realizing that the same thing is being done to the nurse in this other home. So I would like to see a little more, I think, vetting. We understand that the services is needed, but at the same time, the adult family home owners cannot take advantage of people who really needs a job and willing to do it, and see that as an opportunity to work these people 24/7. Long story short, the last one, I call a meeting with my son's case manager, along with the owner, and bring over, my own, what I witnessed happening, and let her know it's just not right. And of course, the case manager says, yeah, we're going to look into it. But this thing persists, and what I realize, that this thing is very prevalent in our state. Just because the services are needed and they want to have someone to do it. But I think it should be done in the right way and treat the nurse or the nurses humanely. You have 3 patients in wheelchair, 1 nurse taking care of 6 or 7 persons. And my son, who's disabled, many times he has to help lift up other patient, cook a meal, and all this type of stuff. And I truly believe it's because they are being allowed to do it. And because there is a need, they are abusing the situation. And I would like to see it addressed. I really do.
Okay, do you have is there a specific question that you would like the legislators to ask?
My question is, are you aware of what goes on in the adult family home in the state of Washington? Are you aware, is there whoever is in above or who belongs or who oversees it, that I would like to see it addressed?
Well, I'm not sure I completely understood your question, but if I understood it correctly, you're raising concerns about the way employees are treated, and therefore the level of care they're able to deliver at adult family homes. So I don't know that I know. I have not had the problem you described to me before, so I am not completely aware of it. I am aware of some of the employment practices that happen in our state with people who are in a situation where they have to work to make, under extraordinary terms in order to pay their bills. And I think we have existing laws to deal with that situation. I think the key is to make sure that the appropriate authorities are aware of it. So I think I'm not going to offer a solution to your problem because I'm not 100% sure I understand it. But to the extent I do understand it, I think that is or at least should be solvable if we have clear understanding. And I'd be happy to listen more and try and take it on. But this is the first time I've been made aware of the situation as you described.
And I'll just add that a lot of the policies or issues that we end up dealing with is because people like you are sharing their stories. Because if these stories aren't shared, we don't necessarily know what is happening. So I do want to thank you for coming here and raising the issue, and I'm sorry that you and your son are having to go through that. But this is where really making sure that whoever is licensing that facility actually has the ability to go in and do inspections. But this is absolutely something, to Senator Braun's point, we're going to need more information about. But it is experiences like this that you bring to us that we can then act upon. So thank you for that.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. Or how many do we have? How many folks still have questions? Oh boy, oh boy. We'll just have. We'll try to get through as many as we can. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Natasha Chicheri. I'm a recent resident of King County. Thank you for sharing today. It's been really great listening to you, and My question's about education. It was great to hear that there's a heavy investment in education, that there's considerations for behavioral and disability within, like, to support a robust education system. And you talked about setting people up for success in K through 12. And I'm just kind of curious, could you speak to the metrics when you're looking at an educational system, what the metrics are by which you're measuring? Are our students successful? Are they going to be successful? Is it more test-based? Is it more of a holistic thing? I'd really love to hear more about that when you're looking at where to place funding and how to assess something. What are the factors?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's one single factor. There's several. I do think that tests are an unimportant factor. Obviously, every kid is more than his test score. But the tests in the aggregate do tell a story. When everybody in the state is taking the same test, it can help you understand what schools are doing better than what other schools. And yes, there's some explanatory variables as well, but we can account for that statistically. It can also be helpful when we're taking the same tests in Washington as they take in all the other states. So we can see, for example, 10 years ago, we were doing way better than Mississippi. Mississippi's doing better than us now. Maybe we should try to figure out why that is, both why we're atrophying and what they're doing in Mississippi to do better. So test scores are a part of that. Certainly we want to pay attention to graduation rates. We're paying all this money to get kids through 12th grade. They've got a constitutional right to do that, and we want to make sure they're actually successful. Another one that is a really disturbing statistic is our college going rate. We have by far the best financial aid package of any state in the country. We also are one of the 2 or 3 most highly educated states in the country. So we have a system now where on average, a kid in high school, his parents are more likely than any other kid in the state, any other kid in the country, to have parents that got a 4-year degree or more. And if he applies for college, he is going to have a better financial aid offer from the state than he would if he were living in any other state. Yet we have the lowest college going rate of any state in the country. How on earth are we giving kids more money than any other state, and they have parents that have been through this more often than any other state, and we're failing? The other metric that I pay attention to is the 3rd grade literacy rate. It is really I don't know if linchpin is the right word, but it has high predictive power on whether a kid will be successful in the long term. The reason is if you can't read at a 3rd grade level, once you hit 3rd grade, you're going to start to fall behind in other things. You suddenly can't read the science textbook. You can't read the social studies textbook. So making sure that kids can read at a 3rd grade level in 3rd grade is really important. And getting back to my point about Mississippi, that's actually how Mississippi did it. Florida did it too. They really invested in early learning, in early elementary literacy, and that really allowed them to succeed in some of the longer term metrics like test scores and graduation rates.
All right, we have another question.
My name is Nick Duda. I'll keep this brief. I find some of the dialogue between different political parties oftentimes disheartening, that there's not more bipartisanship, not more acknowledgement of the other side having good ideas. As I have sort of recorded today, I find there's 3 areas that I've heard some commonality. They boil down to make it easier to build more housing, give kids lunches at school, and hire some ambiguous number of more cops. Can each of you be specific on one policy proposal championed by the other party that you would support in this legislative session? Appreciate the time.
Sure. I would say in the Senate, 95% of the bills that we pass are bipartisan. And that's a statistic that most people are really surprised to hear. But 95% of the work that we do is bipartisan. There are large pieces of the policy that are bipartisan. I know Senator Braun mentioned mental health is one that's mostly been bipartisan. Actually, Senator Holy and I are doing the bill on the $100 million for law enforcement. He has agreed to sign my bill that the teens are doing in providing a drug test strips. So there's actually a lot more policies that we agree on than what we disagree on. The things that we disagree on tend to be things that are very political and are in part of the news cycle. But I would say I've actually been really impressed by the level of bipartisanship in the Senate. We have great conversations, we hang out together, and even when we have the other party that may not be voting on a bill, their ideas are incorporated into those bills.
So I'm working with the chair in education on a chronic absenteeism bill that is important an important issue in our state. I don't have enough time to go into the details, but that's a good example. Working with Senator Peterson, the leader of the Senate Democrats, on a special education bill, and have worked in the past on special education with Senator Wellman. So there's lots of examples. Senator Dhingra is exactly right. 85, 90% is either unanimous or bipartisan, and those are important bills. It's true also that remaining 10 to 15% are very difficult issues, but we have some great historic examples here in our state. Sometimes it takes us a few years. We talked earlier about behavioral health. This is something we've worked on for many years, and we continue to. And this doesn't mean we've always agreed. We've just found a way to find agreement over time. But we also had some very challenging ones in the last couple of years. Think about the state Supreme Blake decision. We struggled. We disagreed, and yet the two of us voted on the same bill 2 years ago to solve a very complex problem in our state that I think, while we're not there yet, we're headed in the right direction. So I think there's both have been good historical examples in that controversial space, and I trust there will be in the future, although I can't not name them all exactly today.
I'll confess I haven't read all of the bills that have been introduced so far. I've been busy with other stuff, and that's on my list to do this weekend. But I was at one of these panels, and Senator Dhingra was there actually earlier this week over on the other side of the lake. And one of our House colleagues who represents the 11th District, which is kind of South Seattle area, was talking about a bill to allow state and local government to use private crime labs to help process crime investigations more quickly. Probably need to learn a little more about it before I definitively say I'm voting yes. I haven't heard the counter arguments yet, but as he's describing it, sounds like a great idea. Yes, we get, as I mentioned at the beginning, we got a lot of issues with public safety, and if one of the solutions can be turning around these cases a little quicker by just having a more bandwidth to do the investigative side of what it takes to bring these cases to trial, that's all for it. No reason the state needs to have a monopoly on this line of business, if as long as the private companies can meet some basic standards, and obviously there's chain of custody stuff to be aware, but assuming it checks sort of the basic constitutional boxes, why on earth should the state think we're the only ones that can do this? Private companies should be able to do this, and it'll help make our criminal justice system run just a little more smoothly. And anyway, he's a former prosecutor. He's dealing with high crime rates in his neighborhood. He's thought about this. I think it's a great idea and would love to hear more. And again, barring new evidence from the other side, I'm inclined to support it right now.
I mentioned Representative Barkis's bill to establish a streamlined process for a property owner to split their lot and build 2 homes instead of 1. That's certainly one I will be supporting.
Okay, great. Hi, my name's Julia Viabat. I'm the chair of the Downtown Community Council. We represent kind of the core area of downtown Seattle. And not a surprise, one of the top priority issues and concerns for folks in our area of town and the state is public safety. However, most people recognize and acknowledge that at its core, it's really a public health crisis, particularly mental and behavioral health, compounded by a lack of affordable housing. So I'm very encouraged by your comments earlier on the level of investment that's being made in mental and behavioral health. I think most people are gaining a confidence of that at the state, county, and city level. Our challenge, though, is we literally, as you know, have people dying on my doorstep on 3rd and Pike and Pine, daily, weekly basis. Mental health crisis that's escalated into a public safety crisis. So I think most people want to know, yes, we've got long-term solutions, medium and long-term solutions in the pipeline. What can and is being done today to save these people's lives and to help them? What more can we do? And that's part A. And then I think the bottleneck that we frequently feel we see and run into is, as you said, not a bipartisan disagreement bottleneck, but actually lack of coordination and accountability at the various levels, like basically jurisdictional issues at the city, county, and state levels. So I'll let you guys decide who wants to answer that.
Well, that's a complicated answer. We're going to need another hour, or question or other. But here's what I would say. So I think our biggest near-term opportunity, we talk about the long-term plan for behavioral health, and I think we're making progress, but the best near-term opportunity for both behavioral health and homelessness, where they overlap, and I believe they overlap a lot, is to find the programs that are succeeding. So what we have right now, both in this area where I'm not as familiar, but certainly in my neck of the woods in Southwest Washington, we have a lot of programs, say, for homelessness. What we have to do a better job is saying, hey, this program over here, it's doing a great job. We should hire him from over here because this program, great people, but they're not being effective. We have to do a better job of deciding. I don't think it's a matter of having to spend more money. If you look at the amount of money we're spending a lot of money, both at the state level and in the local government. What we're not doing is being selective and saying and rewarding the folks who are doing a good job, saving lives, and saying, hey, the folks that aren't succeeding, we appreciate you're committed, but you're not on the right track. You're going to have to go find a different way, and we're going to expand this program. We need to be more efficient at choosing winners, and government is always great at that, but in this case we have the statistics. We know when people in my neck of the woods, we were struggling with some of our homeless services with a local organization. We looked at Grays Harbor next door, where they had an organization that was having some really good success, and to their credit, the county commissioners said, oh, we're going to hire them, and they're off to a great start there in Lewis County. So we just got to, I think that's something we can do. That was less than a year. They made that change, having immediate effects. So a lot of these are local decisions, and the state has to do a better job of empowering locals to say, pick the right organizations to get the job done. We are the masters of our own destiny in this situation if we just are honest with what's delivering results and what's not delivering results.
I'll start off by saying that I think Seattle has a very unique problem because the number of people who have a severe mental illness is very high. And that's there because, yes, there was a time when other areas around the state were shipping their very severely ill homeless people to downtown Seattle. It is true. And so the population that Seattle is dealing with is different than in many other parts of the state. And I'm going to say something that I've said for a long time, which is controversial, which is if you want true mental health and physical health parity, then when someone is having an active psychotic break on the street, you need to make sure there's an ambulance that comes, stabilizes the person, and then you deal with getting that person an attorney so they can talk about civil rights in being forcefully medicated. We don't give a person having a heart attack an attorney to say, can we, let's talk about your legal rights before we stabilize you. We do that for mentally ill individuals. We gotta make sure we're stabilizing people who are struggling and then talking to them about options for treatment. I fundamentally believe that is something that is going to change and help the downtown Seattle corridor. I've tried for many, many years. There's a lot of pushback, but we're trying to get there. But you have to have a balanced approach in how we're taking care of the most sick among us.
Yep. Thank you so much. I'm Reed Saris with the Children's Alliance, and just wanted to push in a little bit on the notion that we're on the right track with youth mental health in particular. And with adults, we have made some great progress. We're middle of the pack. There are some of the challenges you talked about in terms of facilities, in terms of providers and these sorts of things. Washington's not unique in those challenges. We are unique in being at the nearly entirely back of the pack. Mental Health America puts us at 48th with youth mental health. The latest survey results of kids showed 15% of adolescents seriously considered suicide within the past year. And I do believe it's a political challenge. I've done the work. I put out a paper with Children's Alliance recently with a set of policy proposals that we are working on with folks in the House and Senate and the governor's office. But there are solutions. States like Colorado had the political will, and they said, we will provide universal access to mental health care for kids. And after they made that decision in the legislature and with the governor, 6 months later, they had it online and ready to go. The state of California has been going the opposite direction of Washington, steadily climbing to middle of the pack and beyond while we've been declining. And so I would ask folks to consider, I heard, we're willing to put a couple $100 million into school lunches. If we could do that with evidence-based mental health I would ask, folks to go down the line, would you support that level of investment in evidence-based mental health? Because it is, I think, a political solution. And you have 47 examples of other states who found the will to do the evidence-based things and get that care out there. And I think we should make those commitments to our kids this session as well.
I 100% agree with you, and I think there is a huge discrepancy between children's mental health and adult mental health, and we are continuing to fail our children. I can tell you, I talk about mental health issues nationally, and I have told providers, you want to come into our state and provide inpatient care, outpatient care, I will do everything I can to try to get you the resources to do it. We do not have providers who are willing to play in this arena. For the last 10 years, we've had programs shutting down. And it does come to money, and it comes to a lot of money. And you're absolutely right. You have to have that political will to spend the money, because without money backing up policy, it's just a good novel to read. And we end up doing that quite a bit. And so, yes, we have a budget shortfall, and this is what I started off this conversation with. You have to figure out, with a balanced budget with no new revenue, who are going to be impacted. It is going to be our children who are most impacted if we pass a budget with no revenue, because that's where the cuts are going to come from, because our children are very expensive and our elderly are very expensive.
Anyone else want to?
Well, the only thing I would add there is I think the other component that often gets left out is we address mental health and behavioral health for children, is we have to do it in a way that involves their families, involves their support network outside the classroom if we're going to be successful. And we often have gone down a path where we're trying to do this exclusive of the families, and I think that's where we get into both political problems and ultimately being successful. We don't very consciously involve the families in that process.
All right, I think we are out of time, and I know there are probably more questions out there. 2 hours, and we didn't get into a lot of issues that I know are going to be coming up, but watch King 5, listen to KUOW. We'll keep you posted. Jeff, will this presentation be posted online through your Facebook or through the YouTube channel? So share that with your friends and family. These are important issues that are going to be dealt with this year. We always say it's the most important election of our lifetime. Maybe this is the most important session of our lifetimes. I don't know. But we appreciate you guys making this time for us. I've got a long list of stories that we'll be following up on with you. And thank you all for your questions as well. I think maybe next year we get to you guys a little sooner because you had some interesting ones, especially Seattle-centric. So thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, the collective. And thank you, Seattle City Club.